Berlin, 1938. The Luftwaffe High Command, confident in its nascent air fleet, formalized a doctrine that prioritized swift, decisive daylight precision bombing, viewing night operations as an impractical secondary concern. This strategic commitment, born from interwar exercises and the Spanish Civil War, would profoundly shape Germany's early war successes and, ultimately, its vulnerabilities when faced with an adversary willing to redefine the parameters of aerial warfare. The stakes were nothing less than the future conduct of air power, its perceived limitations, and the very survival of the Reich under sustained aerial assault. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, then chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, articulated this prevailing sentiment with an almost theological certainty, his pronouncements echoing through the corridors of the Reich Air Ministry. His operational directives consistently emphasized the inherent superiority of visual targeting, deeming the complexities of nocturnal navigation and accurate bomb delivery insurmountable obstacles for any air force of the era. This conviction was not merely an opinion. It was codified into training manuals and procurement specifications, dictating the design of aircraft and the skill set of air crews. The Junkers Ju-88, a versatile medium bomber then entering service, exemplified this doctrinal bias. Its primary bomb aiming system, the Luftwaffe 7, was an optical device requiring clear visual contact with the target. Its sophisticated gyroscopic stabilization and magnification were rendered largely useless in the absence of daylight or significant illumination, limiting its precision to conditions of optimal visibility. The aircraft's internal design reflected this, with minimal provisions for specialized night flying equipment beyond basic navigation lights and rudimentary radio direction finding apparatus. Production logs from Dessau and Bernburg indicated a consistent output of approximately 60 Ju-88s per month by late 1939, each configured for daylight missions. The training regimen at bomber schools across Germany, from Brandis to Brieg, reinforced this daylight focus. Pilots and bombardiers spent countless hours practicing high-altitude runs against ground targets under varied weather conditions, but always with the sun illuminating their objectives. Night flying, when it occurred, was largely restricted to basic instrument familiarization and occasional cross-country navigation, never approaching the complexity of a combat mission. This emphasis on visual targeting stemmed from a deeply ingrained belief in the psychological impact of visible destruction and the perceived inefficiency of blind bombing. The technical limitations of the period, particularly in radar and infrared detection, reinforced this view. Without reliable means to locate and identify targets in darkness, the German High Command saw night bombing as an exercise in futility, an indiscriminate waste of resources with negligible strategic return. The prevailing wisdom was that effective bombing required eyes on the target, a principle that would define the early years of the conflict. The summer of 1940 brought the first sustained British nocturnal aerial incursions over the Reich. These early Royal Air Force night raids, often comprising fewer than 50 aircraft, were initially viewed by German Air Defense Command as more of a nuisance than a genuine threat to national security or industrial output. Damage assessments from the Luftwaffe commandos frequently described scattered bomb impacts across open fields or minor structural damage to non-critical infrastructure, reinforcing the perception that precision night bombing was an impossibility. Reconnaissance photographs, meticulously analyzed by Luftwaffe intelligence, showed an average circular error probable (CEP) for bombs dropped at night exceeding 5 kilometers from the intended target. This wide dispersion meant that even heavily defended industrial complexes, like the Ruhr's steelworks, often escaped significant damage. The operational reports from Nachtjagdgeschwader units, detailing limited engagements and few confirmed kills, further contributed to the prevailing German belief that their night fighter defenses, while still developing, were sufficient to deter effective British night operations. However, the psychological impact on the civilian population, though not immediately quantifiable in economic terms, began to register in local government reports. While direct casualties remained low, the disruption of sleep and the constant threat of distant explosions, even if inaccurate, began to erode morale in some urban centers. These reports, often buried within larger administrative documents, were largely dismissed by higher command, which prioritized material damage assessments over subjective public sentiment. Despite the low material impact, the sheer persistence of the raids, even in small numbers, necessitated a continuous deployment of anti-aircraft artillery and fighter assets, drawing resources away from other fronts. Flak divisions, totaling over 2,000 heavy and light guns by late 1940, consumed significant ammunition stockpiles and required constant manning, a drain on manpower that was beginning to be felt in other sectors of the war economy. The Luftwaffe Fighter Command, too, had to divert day fighters for night defense training and deployment, subtly impacting their readiness for daylight operations. The British, for their part, understood the limitations of their early night bombing. Air Staff operational research, based on post-raid photographic analysis and returning aircrew debriefs, confirmed the widespread inaccuracy. Yet the strategic directive from Bomber Command remained resolute: maintain pressure on German industry and urban centers, even if the immediate damage was light, to force a diversion of German resources and to prepare for a future, more effective bombing campaign. This sustained, if imprecise, pressure kept the threat alive, preventing the Germans from entirely dismissing the potential of night air attack. Great Britain, 1941. The relentless attrition of night bombing raids over Germany, conducted largely by celestial navigation and dead reckoning, yielded an average circular error probable of 5 miles, rendering precision attacks on industrial targets an impossibility. The Royal Air Force Bomber Command, facing unacceptable losses for negligible strategic effect, desperately sought a technological advantage to penetrate the darkness and locate targets with greater accuracy. This imperative drove the accelerated development and deployment of radar systems, transforming the very nature of aerial warfare. The first operational solution arrived in the form of GEE, a hyperbolic navigation system. Its principle relied on ground-based master and slave stations transmitting synchronized radio pulses. An aircraft equipped with a GEE receiver measured the time difference between these pulses, translating them into lines of position on a special chart. Where two such lines intersected, the aircraft's precise geographical location was established. The system's effective range extended to approximately 350 miles from the transmitting stations, covering much of the Ruhr and central Germany from bases in England. GEE's initial deployment in March 1942, aboard Stirling and Wellington bombers, immediately demonstrated its potential. Navigator logs from early missions consistently reported position fixes accurate to within a quarter mile, a dramatic improvement over previous methods. This newfound accuracy allowed for more precise approaches to target areas, reducing the time spent searching and thus exposure to flak and night fighters. Production ramped up swiftly, with over 1,000 GEE sets manufactured and installed by the end of 1942, equipping a significant portion of Bomber Command's operational fleet. The system, while revolutionary, was susceptible to jamming, a vulnerability the Germans quickly exploited once its operational parameters were understood. The limitations of GEE, particularly its reliance on ground stations and susceptibility to countermeasures, spurred the development of H2S, an airborne ground mapping radar. This system operated on a different principle, emitting microwave pulses downwards and detecting the echoes reflected from the terrain below. These echoes were then displayed on a cathode ray tube, creating a rudimentary but recognizable image of the ground beneath the aircraft. Water bodies appeared dark, built-up areas bright, and open land varied in between. The ability to see through clouds and darkness, independent of ground-based transmitters, offered a profound tactical advantage. H2S units, first deployed in January 1943 aboard Halifax and Stirling aircraft, operated at a wavelength of 10 centimeters, a frequency chosen for its ability to penetrate precipitation and provide higher resolution than earlier radar bands. The system's antenna, often housed in a distinctive blister under the aircraft's fuselage, rotated continuously, scanning the terrain in a circular pattern. The radar operator, a specialist aircrew member, learned to interpret the often abstract patterns on the screen, correlating them with maps to identify key geographical features like coastlines, major rivers, and large urban centers. Initial training was arduous, as the interpretation of radar imagery was a novel skill requiring significant practice and spatial reasoning. The strategic implications of H2S were immense. It allowed Armor Command to navigate accurately to targets deep within Germany, even in conditions of complete overcast or fog, where visual navigation was impossible. Damage reports from raids utilizing H2S showed a marked improvement in target concentration, particularly on urban areas. The ability to identify major cities and even discern larger industrial complexes from the air, regardless of weather, fundamentally altered the calculus of the night bombing campaign. The Germans, initially baffled by the sudden precision of attacks in poor weather, soon realized a new technology was at play, but its airborne nature made direct jamming far more complex than with GEE. The introduction of H2S marked a pivotal shift, transforming night bombing from an often random affair into a more consistently destructive force, even when the target remained obscured by cloud. The Ruhr Valley, late 1943. The initial assessments from German Air Defense Headquarters had been dismissive of the sustained threat posed by RAF night operations. Luftwaffe intelligence reports, often based on early war experiences and the perceived limitations of navigation in darkness, consistently underestimated the potential for concentrated damage. This confidence, however, began to erode as the weight of Bomber Command's nocturnal offensive shifted from area harassment to precision targeting. The early radar bombing systems, while crude by later standards, offered a significant leap in accuracy over purely celestial or dead reckoning navigation. The H2S ground mapping radar, first deployed operationally in January 1943, allowed bombardiers to identify distinct geographical features through cloud cover or at night, providing a consistent reference point that was previously unattainable. Its initial resolution, approximately 30 meters at 10,000 feet, permitted the identification of major waterways, urban outlines, and large industrial complexes, transforming the efficacy of night attacks. Before H2S, a significant portion of bombs dropped at night fell kilometers from their intended targets, often impacting open countryside or residential areas with limited strategic value. Post-H2S deployment, damage reports from cities like Hamburg and Essen showed a marked increase in the concentration of destruction within designated industrial zones and city centers. For example, a damage assessment following the July 1943 Hamburg raids indicated that 75% of the total destruction occurred within a 3-kilometer radius of the primary aiming point, a dramatic improvement over previous campaigns where similar concentrations were rare. The strategic implication was profound. German industrial output, particularly in critical sectors like armaments and synthetic fuel production, began to show measurable declines. Production logs from the Krupp works in Essen, for instance, recorded a 20% drop in steel output during the last quarter of 1943, directly attributed to sustained night bombing and the disruption of worker shifts and infrastructure. The psychological impact on the civilian population, no longer assured of relative safety under the cover of darkness, compounded the material losses. The German response, initially focused on increasing night fighter patrols and anti-aircraft artillery, proved increasingly insufficient. The sheer volume of the attacking force, coupled with the enhanced accuracy, overwhelmed defensive capabilities. The belief that darkness provided an impenetrable shield, a core tenet of early German air defense strategy, was systematically dismantled by the persistent unseen hand of radar-guided destruction. The Reich Air Ministry, October 1943. The official communiques, issued with increasing frequency, maintained a consistent narrative. Allied night bombing, while a nuisance, inflicted no strategic damage. This public stance was echoed in internal memoranda, though with nuanced caveats regarding localized disruption. The German High Command, particularly Goering, publicly dismissed the precision claims of the Royal Air Force, characterizing their night operations as indiscriminate terror attacks with negligible military impact. Damage assessment reports, however, painted a different picture. While the propaganda machine highlighted the resilience of the German people and the rapid repair of infrastructure, the underlying figures from the Ministry of Armaments and War Production detailed a steady erosion of capacity. For example, the October 1943 attack on Kassel, an industrial hub, resulted in the destruction of 80% of the city center and significant damage to Fieseler aircraft factories, disrupting production for weeks. Yet official statements minimized these losses, emphasizing the continued output of critical war materiel. These assessments often contrasted sharply with the experiences of local industrial managers and regional party officials, whose urgent pleas for improved air defenses and more accurate damage estimates were frequently downplayed or outright dismissed by Berlin. The official line held that the vast majority of bombs fell harmlessly in open fields or residential areas, avoiding key industrial targets. This narrative served to bolster morale and maintain the illusion of control. Even as the cumulative effect of the raids became undeniable, the denial extended to the effectiveness of Allied navigation and bombing aids. German intelligence reports, though often fragmented, did acknowledge the use of new technologies like H2S radar by the RAF. However, these capabilities were consistently underestimated, portrayed as unreliable and easily countered. The prevailing belief, heavily influenced by pre-war doctrines, was that true precision bombing was only possible in daylight, under clear visibility. This ideological adherence to established principles created a blind spot. The strategic implications of sustained, accurate night bombing were not fully grasped, or perhaps were too unsettling to acknowledge. The idea that an enemy could strike critical industrial targets with increasing regularity under the cover of darkness challenged fundamental assumptions about air defense and the sanctity of the homeland. The official denial, therefore, became a self-reinforcing cycle. By downplaying the effectiveness of the raids, the urgency to develop effective countermeasures or to reevaluate strategic priorities was diminished. The focus remained on interceptor production and anti-aircraft artillery, while the more insidious threat of radar-guided precision bombing at night was relegated to a secondary concern, a problem that would eventually be solved by superior German ingenuity, or so it was publicly declared. Northern Germany, early 1944. The wreckage of a Halifax bomber, downed during a raid on Brunswick, yielded an unfamiliar array of equipment. German technical intelligence teams, already grappling with the implications of the GEE navigation system, now faced a more complex and ultimately more devastating discovery. Within the shattered fuselage, alongside the standard radio equipment, were components unlike any previously encountered in Allied aircraft. The primary discovery was the H2S radar set, its scanning antenna crumpled but largely intact, protected within its radome beneath the fuselage. This device operated on a wavelength of 10 centimeters, a frequency far higher than the German Würzburg or Freya systems, offering significantly improved resolution. Its parabolic reflector, approximately 3 feet in diameter, was designed to rotate continuously, painting a ground map on a cathode ray tube display in the bomber's navigation compartment. This was not merely a navigation aid, it was a precision bombing instrument. Further examination of the recovered H2S system revealed its operational principles. The radar emitted pulses, and the echoes returning from the ground were processed to create a visual representation of terrain features, including coastlines, rivers, and built-up areas. Urban centers, with their dense concentrations of reflective surfaces, appeared as bright, distinct blobs on the navigator's screen. This allowed for target identification and bomb release even through thick cloud cover or at night, rendering traditional visual bombing methods obsolete in adverse conditions. Intelligence reports from occupied territories and intercepted communications, initially dismissed as anecdotal, now took on a chilling new significance. Reports from German anti-aircraft units frequently mentioned bombs falling with unnerving accuracy despite complete overcast conditions, often accompanied by the absence of visual flares or pathfinder marking. These observations, once attributed to luck or isolated navigation errors, were now understood as direct consequences of the H2S system's deployment. Production logs from British factories confirmed a rapid increase in H2S unit manufacturing throughout late 1943, indicating widespread integration into the bomber fleet. By January 1944, over 500 such units had been delivered to Bomber Command. The strategic implication was immediate and profound. The Luftwaffe's night fighter defenses, reliant on visual acquisition or the relatively primitive Liechtenstein radar, were fundamentally outmaneuvered. The German High Command's previous assertions that night bombing could be effectively countered were now demonstrably false. The realization dawned that the Allied bomber offensive, far from being blunted, was entering a new, more destructive phase. The ability to bomb accurately, regardless of weather or darkness, negated many of the defensive advantages previously held by German air defenses. The night, once a shield, was now an accomplice to the attackers. Berlin, early 1944. The sustained pressure from the Royal Air Force's night bombing campaign, now augmented by advanced radar techniques, began to erode the German High Command's earlier pronouncements of air superiority and the effective neutralization of bomber threats. Initial assessments, rooted in the perceived invulnerability of the Reich's air defenses and the expected limits of Allied navigation, proved increasingly untenable as damage reports accumulated. The strategic implications of this new phase of aerial warfare forced a re-evaluation of fundamental defensive doctrines. The initial German response to night bombing had focused on a layered defense of searchlights, flak, and night fighters, designed to break up formations and inflict attrition. This system, while often effective against visually navigated raids, struggled against aircraft operating above the cloud cover or in darkness, guided by instruments alone. The introduction of H2S radar, allowing bombers to see the ground below, rendered large portions of this established defense obsolete, particularly over urban centers. Damage assessments from cities like Hamburg and Berlin, compiled from municipal records and industrial surveys, showed a marked increase in precision and concentration of bomb impacts. Where earlier raids often scattered their payloads over broad areas, the radar-guided attacks demonstrated an alarming ability to hit specific industrial targets and residential districts with greater accuracy. This shift from area bombing to more focused destruction represented a qualitative leap in the effectiveness of the Allied offensive. The German Air Ministry's own intelligence reports, derived from captured equipment and interrogations of downed aircrew, confirmed the widespread deployment of radar navigation systems. These reports detailed the operational characteristics of devices like H2S, explaining its ability to generate a ground map display for the bombardier. The technical specifications outlined in these documents directly contradicted earlier assumptions that night bombing would remain an imprecise and largely ineffective endeavor. Production logs from key industrial sectors revealed a correlating decline in output, directly attributable to the escalating damage from these radar-guided raids. Factories producing armaments, aircraft components, and synthetic fuels reported significant disruptions, with some facilities experiencing complete destruction. The cumulative effect of these attacks began to impact the overall war economy, creating bottlenecks in critical supply chains. The Luftwaffe's strategic planning staff, reviewing these mounting losses and the undeniable evidence of precision night bombing, faced a stark reality. The belief that German air defenses could contain or defeat the bomber threat had been predicated on a technological and tactical advantage that no longer existed. The operational reality of radar-guided attacks demanded an urgent and fundamental shift in defensive strategy, moving beyond mere attrition to a more comprehensive and technologically advanced countermeasure. This realization permeated the highest levels of the German military and political leadership, forcing a reluctant acknowledgement that the aerial threat was not only persistent, but evolving in ways that challenged their foundational assumptions of air defense. The initial dismissals of the bomber's long-term effectiveness gave way to a sober assessment of its devastating potential, particularly under the cover of night. The war in the air had entered a new, more dangerous phase, one for which Germany was largely unprepared. Germany, January 1944. The full scope of the nocturnal devastation, now undeniable, forced a belated and frantic reevaluation within the German High Command. The illusion of air superiority, or even parity, had shattered under the weight of mounting wreckage and civilian casualties. Air Defense Command reports detailed an escalating crisis, with cities like Berlin, Leipzig, and Frankfurt experiencing unprecedented levels of destruction, often without clear warning from conventional detection methods. The immediate response was a desperate scramble for countermeasures. Production targets for night fighters, particularly the Me-110 and Ju-88 variants equipped with Liechtenstein radar, were dramatically increased. Production logs from Messerschmitt and Junkers show a 40% increase in monthly output targets for these specialized aircraft by February 1944, a figure that strained an already overtaxed industrial base. However, the crews operating these aircraft often lacked sufficient training in radar interception, and the technology itself was constantly evolving, presenting new challenges. Operational directives from the Reich Air Ministry emphasized the urgent need for improved ground-based radar networks. The existing Freya and Würzburg systems, while effective for early warning and target acquisition against daylight raids, proved less adept at tracking the dispersed, high-altitude formations of British bombers operating under the cover of darkness. Intelligence assessments, compiled from captured equipment and interrogation files, revealed the sophistication of Allied jamming techniques, which further degraded German radar performance. The strategic implication was profound. The air war, once considered a German strength, had irrevocably shifted. The Luftwaffe, designed for offensive blitzkrieg operations and daylight interception, found itself in a reactive, defensive posture, continuously outmaneuvered by the technological and tactical innovations of the Allied bomber forces. The very concept of German air defense, predicated on visual identification and localized interception, was rendered obsolete by the precision of radar bombing. This forced a fundamental reevaluation of resource allocation. Fuel, once plentiful for training and offensive sorties, became a critical constraint, diverted almost entirely to defensive operations. Pilot training programs were shortened, reducing the proficiency of new recruits. Ammunition expenditure rates, detailed in ordnance supply ledgers, surged by 60% in the first quarter of 1944 compared to the previous year. Yet the kill ratios against Allied bombers remained stubbornly low. The belated understanding of the radar bombing threat meant that Germany was always playing catch-up. Each new German countermeasure, from improved radar sets to experimental night fighter designs, was met with an Allied innovation, maintaining the technological advantage. The British window, chaff, introduced in 1943, had already demonstrated the vulnerability of German radar, and subsequent developments continued to widen the gap. The ideological impact within the German leadership was significant. The early boasts of an impenetrable Reich were replaced by grim assessments of vulnerability. Propaganda efforts struggled to explain the relentless destruction, often resorting to blaming individual failures rather than acknowledging the systemic technological disparity. The psychological effect on the civilian population, enduring nightly raids with little effective defense, was corrosive. The shift represented a strategic defeat long before the ground war reached German soil. The ability of Allied bombers to strike deep into the heart of German industry and infrastructure, largely unimpeded by effective night defenses, crippled war production and morale.